The information presented in this recording contains examples of real-life project experiences and does not constitute legal advice. Contracting authorities should seek appropriate legal or other professional advice for their specific projects before taking or refraining from action as a result of the contents of this recording. This masterclass was recorded on the 9th of March 2021 via WebEx, provided to you by the Commercial Skills Academy of the Office of Government Procurement. This masterclass's aim is to provide an overview of cloud computing advice in the context of the Public Service ICT strategy, and to provide public servants with an understanding of cloud procurement and cloud solutions and explain how it is different to other IT solutions. Embarking on a cloud procurement, what obligations and contractual considerations are there? Finally, a case study on the impact and benefits of using a cloud solution. In today's masterclass, Enda Holland, ICT Digital Strategy and Policy Unit, OGCIO, presents an overview of cloud computing advice in the context of the Public Service ICT strategy. Fergal Ryan and John Gary, Category Managers, ICT Sourcing, OGP, share information about Cloud Services Procurement Guidance Note. Ray Murphy, Lead ICT Consultant, Strategic Computing Limited, will talk about contractual obligations and considerations of cloud procurement. Finally, Mark Burke, Chief Quantity Surveyor, Dublin City Council, will present Payment Solution Service, a case study of cloud-based solutions by Dublin City Council. The masterclass concludes with an open panel Q&A discussion and closing remarks by Debbie Curtis, Office of Government Procurement Moderator. Enda Holland, ICT Digital Strategy and Policy Unit, OGCIO. Overview of cloud computing advice in the context of the Public Service ICT strategy.
Retain should not be a long-term decision given the challenges regarding costs and the skills required for supporting such systems. Options for migrating a system range from rehosting, so that's where you make some small modifications, it's just enough to move the application, but taking no real advantage of cloud capabilities, to redesigning, where you make some smaller changes or even major changes to take some or greater advantage of cloud capability, to full replacement, where the system is designed from the ground up for cloud. The third principle is that a move to cloud will be a business decision on the basis of specific considerations. So while taking a cloud-first approach, organizations should continue to assess their own requirements and seek solutions that best enable them to achieve their business needs. And in all this, a cloud-first approach does not mean a cloud-only approach, and financial, compliance, technical, the risk profile of data and other issues may determine that cloud in some or all of its variations is not suitable in certain circumstances. Now, in terms of delivery models, the advice note identifies four, which are similar to the NIST mentioned earlier. These are private government cloud, public cloud over private network, and hybrid. So in the private government cloud model, cloud infrastructure, they're designed for configuration for exclusive use by users from government organizations. The infrastructure is owned, managed, and operated by or on behalf of government, and a private government cloud can exist on or off premise and is only accessible via government networks. Public cloud infrastructure is designed and configured for open use by the general public and exists on the premise of the cloud provider. Public cloud providers can offer standard repeatable services at scale and on demand, and the main providers operate on a global basis and can meet large scale demand and requirements. Public cloud over private network. In this model, the public cloud infrastructure is used, but it's accessed over a private network or a dedicated communications link. Public cloud resources are interconnected to the internal resources of the organization's own data center. A public cloud over private network exists off-premise and is primarily only accessible via government networks. Using public cloud services is not an all or nothing decision, and a hybrid approach using services from both public cloud provider as well as on-premise government managed private cloud may be the appropriate approach in some circumstances. And organizations in such scenarios can split content and capability between the public cloud and the private government cloud. This approach takes advantage of public cloud while addressing the considerations that make private cloud more appropriate. And a hybrid can exist on or off premise, and it is accessible via government networks. So in the advice note, we set out a number of factors to consider when making decisions around moving to cloud. And these are ones that were highlighted in consultations and discussions at the time of the advice note. And you'll see more detail on these in the advice note itself, but I'll go through each of them now. I mentioned at the start that the cloud computing services should be considered potentially suitable for any category of public service information or system, except where such data will be classified as top secret, according to Circular 3709. Just show you that there now. For example, material that will put at risk the life or safety of an individual or pose a serious threat to the economic interests of the state. So there's a number of examples there. Organizations need to be able to identify the sensitivity of their data and categorize it accordingly. The Department of Foreign Affairs, for example, has a data classification system, but many organizations do not. At the EU, also have classified information categorized at 4 levels. So there's EU top secret, secret, confidential, and restricted. And organizations that handle EU classified information are required to respect these. Product refers to organizations needing to be aware that of the roadmaps for the various products that they use, particularly if the product is moving to a cloud-only delivery model, and be sure that they understand the implications of this. Understanding how you use your own products is also important too, particularly around the predictability or otherwise of usage, or whether usage is seasonal, etc. Other considerations here include the resilience of the cloud offering, the implications of migrating applications to the cloud as they are versus modernizing them in advance or replacing them altogether. When considering public or private cloud, a balance needs to be struck between confidentiality, integrity, and availability requirements. For example, information already in the public domain has no confidentiality requirements, but may have very high availability requirements and will be ideal for the cloud. Other considerations include obligations around data retention, National Archives requirements, and solution access requirements. A key point also is the capacity and skills of organizations to properly use and manage the cloud service. In terms of data sharing and reuse, organizations need to be aware of the Public Service Data Strategy and the Data Sharing and Governance Act 2019 when considering using cloud-based services, and ensure that their choices support and facilitate data sharing and reuse. In terms of data processing, here we're talking about ensuring that the security concerns around data are proactively addressed while it is being processed, while it is being stored, and also while it is moving. Organizations need to be clear on their data protection obligations, but must also ensure that these obligations are not used as a reason not to use cloud services without clear justification. In considering the location of data, organizations should also ensure that they can access their data in a way that they want to, for example, through APIs. And if real-time checks are required, issues such as volumes and latency should be considered, particularly if the data is geographically very distant. Other considerations here include questions such as where exactly is the data stored, where the backup stored, what is the audit capability, who has access to the outcome, and issues around encryption and key management, who is the custodian of the encryption keys. In terms of timing, the timescale to move to cloud depends on a number of factors, including the nature of the project, an organization's understanding of the various options, the in-house skills required and available to manage cloud services, no matter how they're provided. In some circumstances, specific urgent project deadlines may necessitate a cloud-based solution. We saw this a lot during the past year, or in others, an on-premise solution may be required. However, in any event, organizations are required to develop a definite move to cloud plan for new and existing systems with targeted deadlines. In terms of governance, cloud computing offers great opportunities for organizations, but it also presents a challenge to existing corporate risk and security management processes. Organizations need to review and update their standards and processes where necessary to reflect these challenges. Issues to consider include a clear division of responsibilities within the organization and between the organization and the cloud service provider. Also ensuring that staff with the necessary level of cloud technology skills are available. Other factors here include, for example, access control, audit trails, as well as data retention and archiving. Very important also is that organizations need a clear exit strategy when they need to change provider. So contractual cover. So the advice note highlights a number of considerations in this area. The new cloud services procurement guidance note from the OGP goes into the key commercial and contractual considerations when procuring cloud computing services in more detail. So I won't go into those here. And the advice note then has some general points around procurement, licensing, costs, skills, and technology that can also be considered. So the advice note mentions the government cloud. So this is as part of the Build to Share program of the ICT strategy. The government cloud is a essentially delivered, scalable private cloud service to offer a best-of-breed technical infrastructure cloud platform. The aim is to drive efficiency, reduce costs, improve security, and support integration. It is supported by government networks, which is also an OGCIO service, and that delivers carrier-grade, resilient, high-capacity private voice, video, and data network services across the public service nationwide. The private government cloud service means that smaller departments and offices will not have to support their own platforms. It uses opportunities to maximize the value of the hardware through sharing and reuse. This sharing of infrastructure is also a key dimension of the state data center project. So, in conclusion, public service organizations need to take a more proactive approach to embracing the opportunities presented by cloud computing. Cloud Advice Note aims to provide high-level guidance to assist public service organizations in doing this. The move to cloud is inevitable for many applications and solutions, whether by choice of the organization or enforced by solution providers. And public service organizations need to develop their own cloud strategy, identifying and prioritizing applications suitable for cloud deployment or migration, and with specific timelines to achieve this. In OGCIO, we welcome the guidance note from our colleagues in OGP, which, as I mentioned, provides public sector organizations with a practical and easy to navigate checklist to assist them in procuring cloud computing services. And you'll hear more about this in a little while. So I think that's it from me. So thank you very much.
Fergal Ryan and John Gary, Category Managers, ITC Sourcing, OGP. Cloud Services Procurement Guidance Note.
The reason we're here today is to try and get a handle up close and personal on the relevance of cloud computing and the various considerations that we need to consider as public procurers. So Enda has already talked us through the background, the increase in demand for cloud services, and the public sector guidance on procuring cloud, which is not a question of if we procure cloud services, but when we procure them and how we procure them. And Ray has already spoken very eloquently about a number of the considerations, and myself and John will expand on what Ray has already discussed, but we'll take a particular perspective on that, which is from the public procurement point of view. And as public procurers, I guess everybody in the audience needs to be particularly mindful of your obligations in that regard. So we'll take you through during the course of the next 20 minutes the background, which I think has already been covered pretty much, the challenges we face as public procurers, how to prepare for public procurement involving cloud, and John will talk you through the key considerations and key clauses. Not all of them, they're all covered in the OGP cloud guidance note, but John will cover some of the key areas there today. I guess in recognition of the significance of cloud services, and in order to put some structure around that, as Enda has already highlighted, the OGCIO published their advice note in November 2019. The OGP has followed with more detailed instructions on the procurement aspects of cloud services, and particularly from a public procurement point of view. The OGP note does provide high-level procurement information and guidance. It also goes into some detail at the back end in terms of the key contractual and commercial considerations. And there's a toolkit provided at the back of that document that helps you to prepare in much the same way that Ray has provided mind maps, which he will share with you. Our guidance note also provides detail at the tables at the back of the document, which should help you when you're preparing for a procurement of cloud services. And it should be noted as well that neither the OGCIO nor the OGP cloud notes should be read in isolation. They should be read together to understand the strategy, but then also in order to understand how to approach your procurement. Some of the specific challenges facing the public sector in terms of procuring cloud services. In the private sector, you can make a decision based on risk and value as to whether you accept cloud service, the cloud service provider's terms and conditions. In the public sector, we don't have that luxury, as we have to provide our contract terms and conditions up front as part of our tender documentation. That's not unique to cloud, but it does present certain unique issues when it comes to procuring cloud services. It's also worth remembering that we can't amend the terms and conditions that we publish with our tender documentation after award. And there are a number of different service models, as has already been highlighted by both Ray and then between software infrastructure and platform as a service. And each of them comes with its own challenges and its own particular characteristics that need to be considered when you're actually completing a procurement. And finally, the commercial considerations. Again, in public procurement, we need, in order to compare apples with apples, and we're not comparing all sorts of different types of fruit, we need to make sure that our commercial constructs are clear at the time of publication. Beg your pardon. There we go. The problem in a nutshell, I guess, is that as a PSB, we have many suppliers, and we try as a public sector in this country, not just in this country, but across all of Europe, we endeavour to have the same contract in place with all of our suppliers, whether it's goods or services or managed services or whatever. We endeavour to have the same form of contract in place. It's easier for us to manage that. The contracts are pre-approved by our legal advisors, and it just makes perfect sense for us to do that. However, in procuring cloud services, we will receive bids from many cloud service providers or CSPs. None of them will be the same. Each one will be different, perhaps subtly different, but nonetheless, they will all be different. However, we do have the obligation, as I mentioned earlier on, to publish our terms and conditions with the tender documentation. So we have a quandary. How do we ensure that our terms and conditions are acceptable to the market while also ensuring that we're adequately protected, while ensuring that we stick to public procurement guidelines in terms of the consistency of approach and the lack of variability to our contract once it's awarded. And our terms and conditions will determine ultimately the level of response and the type of response we get from the market. So these are things we need to consider from a PSB's perspective. From the perspective of a cloud service provider, they have the same dilemma, except in reverse. So they have agreements potentially with hundreds or thousands of clients. They need to standardize their offering because they are managing a single infrastructure or a single platform or a single application set for all of those customers. So in order to ensure ease of management, they need consistency in their agreements. And of course, their service offering affords no customization, which is quite a significant difference between what most people would be used to with their in-house applications. In order to standardize their contracts, and the reason that CSPs insist on their terms is ensure that they have consistency of service level agreements across their client base, and to ensure that their risk and liability is evenly spread across that client base. It's understandable because they have, you know, as a single provider, they do have all of these clients and they do need to standardize and try and make sure that things are as balanced as possible. So with that in mind, depending on the terms and conditions that we publish as public bodies, a CSP may or may not be prepared to accept those terms and conditions. So in order to try and mitigate the impact of publishing terms and conditions which are not acceptable, we need to consider the two forces at play here. The irresistible force is cloud service provision. It's gaining in momentum, it's gaining in popularity, and it's the obvious benefits associated with it, like scalability, flexibility, and the lower total cost of ownership are kind of irresistible, along with the public sector guidance on that from the OGCIO, which says that you should and you must consider cloud in all of your future procurements of technology. So we could take an adversarial approach like Superman and the Hulk there. We could just publish bland terms and conditions, our standard state contract, and fight it out with them at the end. Or we could, a little bit more like the waves washing over the rocks, we could take a little bit more of an organic approach, and we could ensure that what we're publishing to the market is acceptable. So with that in mind, I guess the key theme for myself and John today is preparation. So this is obviously a key element of any procurement, whether it's cloud services, whether it's any other type of procurement, but it's particularly important from the point of view of cloud services. Now, Ray has already mentioned doing a market analysis. That's key, but there's a lot of other areas as well that you need to consider. I would recommend that you read the OGCIO and the Cloud Services Procurement Guidance Note. Not just saying that because we wrote it and we think it's a pretty comprehensive document, but it actually does provide useful information which will help you if you're considering a cloud procurement. We would recommend always publishing a request for information, allowing the market to tell you what kind of offering they have and under what terms and conditions they might be prepared to offer that to you. There's other ways of conducting market research as well. Google is a great man, and of course there's many white papers and other forms of media through which you can gain access to market research which has been conducted by others and which you may find useful for yourself. You should always consult with your peers. So generally speaking, I'm not quite sure whoever has been the first, but generally speaking, we're not the first to do a procurement of a particular type. There will always be somebody else who's done it first. I'm not quite sure how that comes to happen. I'm sure there's some sort of a law of nature about that, but there always seems to be somebody else who's done it. And we should always learn from other people's experiences and mistakes. And I wouldn't limit that to public bodies within this country either. Many of us have networks with other jurisdictions, with public bodies and other jurisdictions. And, you know, this is the procurement of cloud services is something which is gaining traction, not just in Ireland, but across all of our European partners as well. And there's many different flavors and types of experience that can be brought to bear just by talking to your peers across Europe. ICT research and advisory services as well, such as Gartner and Forrester, offer very valuable insights into the nature of cloud services, cloud technology, and also the procurement of those services. And of course, and one thing that we can't emphasize enough is that you must consult with your legal advisors and perhaps possibly your commercial or other expert advisors as well before entering into the realm of procurement of cloud. So I guess the key theme for us from a public procurement point of view today is prepare. You need to prepare. You need to make sure that what you're going out to the market with is safeguarding the state, is safeguarding yourselves as PSBs from risk, but is also going to elicit responses which will be meaningful and which ultimately will deliver your solution to elicit those responses from the market. I'll hand over to John now, who'll talk you through in more detail some of the key considerations and contractual aspects of procuring cloud services.
Okay, we're back up and running. So over the next 2 slides, I'm just going to go over some key considerations for public service bodies when they're procuring cloud services, and I'm also going to cover some key clauses that public service bodies can consider, including in their tender documents. This is only a very high-level overview of the key considerations and the clauses, and the guidance note contains a much more extensive list of considerations and goes into much greater detail on each of these topics that I'm going to discuss. So if you're looking for information, that's the place to go. So just starting into the key considerations slide, I'm just going to go through this in clockwise order, starting in the top left corner. So first up, a key consideration for any PSB who's going to be procuring cloud services is data security and data protection. And areas to consider in relation to this are data security. And what you'll be considering in terms of data security is you'll be looking at, setting out the roles and responsibilities of the CSP and the PSB in relation to the security of your data. And this will vary depending on the type of cloud services that you're buying. So for example, if you're buying infrastructure as a service, you'll find that the CSP would be responsible for the security of the underlying infrastructure, whereas the CSP would be responsible for any of the software applications that will be running on that. So it will depend on the type of cloud service that you're providing. Other areas to consider in relation to data security are data encryption. Do you want your data encrypted? Do you want it encrypted when it's backed up? Things like that. You'll also be looking at the data integrity, and this will be the type of cloud service instance that you want to use. Do you want to use a multi-tenancy environment or a single tenancy environment? And considerations in relation to that would be, will you be using a shared database with other customers? So all these are key considerations for data security. In terms of data protection, because your data, even though your data is going to be on the CSP's data center, you are still responsible and accountable for the data as the PSB. So any contract or that you develop in relation to cloud services, you have to ensure that it's fully compliant with GDPR. And this links into where is the data resident. If you are thinking of transferring your data outside of the EEA, you have to ensure that it's fully compliant with GDPR. And just to bear in mind, recently there was a judge, the Schrems 2 judgment ruled that the privacy shield regime is no longer valid. So it's areas like that you need to be careful of when considering cloud services. Other considerations might be in terms of the processing of your data. Who can access your data, what type of processing can take place in that. All that falls under GDPR, and it's something that every PSB has to consider before procuring a cloud service. In terms of data of access, then the things that you would be looking at is is how would you manage a data subject access request, or again, who can access your data, what type of processing can take place in your data, including what sort of processing could take place by sub-processors. So again, all considerations in relation to data access. Also, audit requests are another thing to consider under data access, the right to audit the CSP. And finally, then under data security and protection, DPIA, which is a data protection impact assessment. Any PSB who is considering procuring cloud services should conduct DPIA and also a data classification exercise, and the outcome of this then would feed into your strategy for procuring cloud services. So it's a very important consideration. Moving on to termination and exit management. Key areas to consider here are the contract term. Generally, you will get more attractive prices if you go for a longer term contract with a CSP. However, you have to balance that with the risk of a long-term contract. You have to consider things like vendor lock-in and the restriction of competitions. The other thing you have to consider is that once you're finished your initial term, you have to look out for things like price increase. You might get very attractive rates up front, but once the contract is extended, those rates may no longer be available. So they're key considerations. Termination is a crucial part of cloud services contract. In terms of termination, you're looking at when you're terminating, coming to the end of the term of the contract, or you might be looking at terminating the contract early, or you might be in the scenario of a sort of a suspension of services. So these are all things that you have to consider. Two factors are really crucial in relation to termination. One is data migration. You need to give yourself sufficient time to migrate your data off the cloud service onto a new cloud service provider or back on premise. Also, you need to give yourself sufficient time to procure a new cloud service provider if you want to move from your old cloud service provider. So these are all key considerations. This ties into exit management. Exit management is really about migrating your data off the cloud service, and areas that you need to look at in relation to that is how you're going to download your data from the service. Is there a data migration tool available for it? Will services be provided to assist you in relation to this? How long it's going to take you to download it? You need to look at the bandwidth available to download it. So it's all these different aspects of exit management that you need to consider and address in your services contract when you're procuring cloud services. Finally, I already mentioned suspension of services, but the key with suspensions of services is you should limit the conditions for suspension of services. Really, it should be limited to things like breach of contract. But again, it's a consideration that you need to take into account. Moving on to services management. A good SLA is key for cloud services. The SLA should clearly define the services that you are looking for, but it also should include clear KPIs, key performance indicators in relation to the delivery of services. And this ties into service credits. Generally, services credits are the main remedies that are used in relation to cloud service providers when you're dealing with poor performance or inadequate performance. So it's key that you put service credits in there that are easy to measure and that there's no ambiguity around them. Finally, onto governance and relationship management. This is around having processes in your documents to define how you're going to work with your CSP. So, for example, you would need a clear process around escalation if any issues arise. So things like that need to be called out within your document. Onto solution assessment. Fergal already covered market research in great detail, so I'll just reiterate that market research is key to defining your requirements in relation to specifications, commercials, and contracts terms and conditions. So do a lot of market research. Pricing models are a key consideration in cloud services. They can be very complex depending on the service model that you're buying. There can be a number of metrics used to calculate cloud services price when you're looking at using a sort of a usage or a consumption model. Some of these metrics might be include pricing per VM or pricing per storage, pricing per network bandwidth, pricing per transaction, and it's often a combination of a number of pricing elements. So you need to really do your research into the pricing model and understand what sort of pricing model you want to use, and then clearly set out what pricing model you are going to be procuring the services under in your RFT document. This links into total cost of ownership. You need to understand what price you will be looking at over the lifetime of the cloud services contract. So factors to look at here include implementation costs, including data migration costs. You also need to look at then usage costs such as subscription or consumption costs. Then you need to look at other costs such as any costs related to data backup or disaster recovery or encryption. And finally, then you need to look at termination costs and clearly define all of these in your RFT document. I've already discussed pricing elements, and just the last point there that it'll be a mixture of fixed and variable pricing elements. The usage and the consumption costs will be variable, whereas other elements such as subscription costs may be fixed. So you will be dealing with a mix of them, but it's key to understand the pricing models that are available out there. Okay, so just moving on to the next slide. Okay, so this slide contains some clauses that you can consider for including in your contract, or provisions that you consider including in your RFT document to address some of the considerations that I set out in the other slide. Again, I'll go around clockwise, starting in the top left-hand quadrant. In relation to termination and exit management, clauses that you can use in relation to the notice period would be, you should set out that a notice period of 1 year at a minimum. So this gives you sufficient time to transition off the cloud service if you require it. It can be tricky transitioning off cloud services, so you should also consider using a clause to rescind a termination notification if required. And I've already covered suspension of data, that you should limit the conditions where a cloud service provider can actually suspend the services. So these are all clauses that you should consider for your services contract. In terms of termination costs, the key clauses you should have here is to define the costs that are associated with termination costs. So you'll be looking at the professional services element, and a way of addressing this would be to include a rate card so that the prices for the professional services are fixed when you're transitioning off the cloud service. Also, you could get maybe an overall total fixed cost for the migration of the data off the service. Again, just defining fixed cost is the key. Another thing to look at is the migration side. Generally, you will get one test download and one live download for free, but after that you will have to pay for any data download. So again, you need to fix costs around those, and you should also call out that any data migration tool that is provided free of charge. In terms of bandwidth restrictions, you need to specify a minimum bandwidth. The danger is that if you don't specify a minimum bandwidth, you get caught by what we call bandwidth throttling, where a very low bandwidth is provided, which makes it very difficult to migrate data off the system. So you want to avoid that. In terms of the data format, then you need to specify what format the data should be returned to you in, e.g. an Excel document, to ensure that the data is usable and that you can also bring it back on premise or load it onto a new cloud service. And finally, deletion of data is crucial. You should include clauses in your contract stating that you have the right to verify that all the data has been deleted off the system when you've exited the system. You should also include a clause stating that the CSP will provide you with certification in relation to this. And finally, you should include a clause giving you the right to audit if you want to go in and verify that the data has been deleted from the system. Okay, so just moving on to the data security and protection. Data encryption clauses to consider here include calling out that the data should be encrypted when it's in transit or it's at rest. Also, another thing is to call out is the minimum encryption standard that you require if the cloud service provider is not going to doesn't define what their minimum encryption standard is. Data backup and disaster recovery, you need to set out your minimum requirements in relation to this, whether you do it by setting out your minimum requirements in an RFT document or you incorporate it into an SLA. There's two approaches there. You also need to be aware that the level, the requirements that you have in relation to this service level may come at an additional cost. So if you're looking for a higher level of service, you may be expected to pay more. But just to consider as well that not all cloud service providers provide data backup or disaster recovery automatically. It is something that you have to call out specifically. Responsibility for security, we've already covered this. Again, you have to call out and clearly define the roles and responsibilities of the CSP and the PSP in relation to cloud security. Or in relation to data security, GDPR compliance, have already gone through this. Again, considerations would be you have to ensure that your all contracts are compliant with GDPR, but you also need to ensure that you call out what can be done to your data in relation to data processing, including in relation to sub-processors. So for example, you might want to call out include a clause that gives you the right to consent to data sub-processors. In addition, you should call out clearly in your contract who the data processor is and who is the data controller. In general, the cloud service provider will be the data processor. However, there can be more complex scenarios where the cloud service provider and a PSP may be joint data controllers. Moving on to pricing, I have gone through a lot of this already. Again, it's all about clearly specifying and defining your prices and understanding the pricing models and setting out each of the cost elements and getting fixed prices on those. In terms of pricing transparency, ensure that you fully understand the pricing model used by the tender and also specify which pricing model you want to avail of in your RFT document. The CSPs will usually offer a number of different pricing models. Cost metrics. Again, you have to understand the cost metrics and you have to be aware of some elements of cost which may not be immediately transparent when you first start looking at pricing models. For example, if you may be looking at sandbox environments, there may be an additional cost for those where you would have to pay for a test environment. Also, another thing to look out for is usage compliance. You may get a license or a subscription, but there may be terms and conditions around the usage, and that if you breach those, you will be penalized. So all these need to be clearly set out in the contract. Data retrieval charges, just to be aware that with some CSPs that you will be charged a fee for downloading documents from the cloud service when you've uploaded your data. So just to be aware that that's addressed in your contract. And total cost of ownership, I've already addressed. Again, it's the implementation cost, the lifetime cost of the service model, subscription or usage cost, and then DR, backup, encryption costs, and finally the termination costs. Jen, moving on to the last quadrant, other considerations. So I've set out non-diminishing services here. What you're really looking for here is that you're putting a clause into the contract stating that you will not accept any amendments to the contracts in terms and conditions through the provision of URL provided links. So you'll see with cloud service providers that sometimes they provide links updating their terms and conditions. So you have to put clauses in rejecting those. Another thing you need to look at is click-through terms and conditions. You should specify in your contract that click-through terms and conditions should be disabled, or at the very least that terms and conditions of the contract that you have put in place will take precedence over any click-through terms and conditions. Service levels and service credits, again, these are key. The key message here is to define your service credits and your KPIs. For example, you need to clearly define what downtime is or what unplanned maintenance is or what planned maintenance is. You need to put clauses in there stating that you can't carry downtime forward. You also need to put clauses in there around reporting provisions on data usage. So how are you going to measure if the service level, if the services are performing as expected. And just for reference, that generally 99.5% uptime is used as base for service availability by cloud service providers. And finally, BYOL stands for bring your own licensing. So just to be aware, when you're migrating any software to the cloud, that you need to understand what your current licenses entitle you to. So for example, there may be a sort of on-premise to cloud services licensing conversion ratio that your license provider will offer you. So it's just to do research into that area. It's not a case of automatically migrating your software to the cloud. You need to check the licenses side of things. Okay, so I'm conscious that there's a lot of information there. So just to reiterate, all this information is available in the cloud services guidance note. And finally, just a quick recap on the main points of the presentation. It's not if, but when for cloud adoption of for adoption of cloud. It's the trend of the market, so it's on its way. Any public procurements must comply with the national procurement regulations and procurement guidelines. Also, it's key to clearly define your requirements in any public procurement document that you develop, including setting out your specifications, your commercial and your commercials and terms and conditions. And key to this is, and crucial, and just to reiterate, is do your research. You have to know the market that you're buying in. And finally, if in doubt, seek guidance. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Ray Murphy, Lead ICT Consultant, Strategic Computing Limited. Contractual obligations and considerations of cloud procurement.
I spent a lot of time in the large IT enterprise procurement area. I've spent 30 years in it, predominantly in the private sector with large organizations. But I've also done some work in public sector as well. So I will be bringing that generic experience, if you like, into play through my presentation. The detail that sits within the OGP cloud guidance note will be addressed by Fergal and John, particularly from a public procurement perspective. I won't be going into that in too much detail. I'll bow to the experts who can talk more lucidly about that. So without any further ado, folks, there's one other thing I should mention. I use the expressions agreement and contract as I go through the presentation. And when I'm talking about agreement, talking about the standard type agreements that cloud service providers use and bring to the table. When I talk about contract, I'll be talking about the contract that we would ultimately have in place between a public sector body and a cloud services provider. The other expressions you'll hear, I tend to use the term supplier and vendor interchangeably. It's the same thing when I talk about each of these. And the other thing I should point out, folks, is that in my slides, I have included images from mind maps. I tend to use mind mapping quite a bit, just for many purposes. At the end of the session, Debbie will be sharing the slides, but I will also make those mind maps available to you as PDFs and in native Mind Manager format. If any of you would like to use them as brainstorming tools for your cloud sessions when you're kicking them off, you're more than welcome to do so. So, my agenda this morning, folks, is in essence looking at the evolution of ICT very quickly from the mainframe environments to the cloud, a little bit about the cloud computing background and context, key considerations from OGCIO. Enda has already covered quite eloquently, and I'll just very quickly breeze through them. And then I'll move into the topics around the cloud contracts and what we see coming into play when we're dealing with the likes of SaaS, software as a service, the OGP guidance notes, and so on. And then I will also talk briefly around cloud commercial topics, and I will leave you with a final slide, which is an articulation of the most recent global ICT, information and communications technology, forecast spend for 2021 and 2022, produced by Gartner in January, just to give you an indication as to how the market is moving and the role and influence of cloud services in that projected spend over the next couple of years. So, very briefly, folks, we've seen significant change in the whole technology landscape over the past number of years. Fortunately or unfortunately, as the case may be, I can relate to every one of these evolutions through the ICT technology domains over the years. I started my background working as a mainframe computer programmer. I worked on mini computers over the years, and then of course I moved into the personal computer domain. Before I moved into the big ticket IT sourcing and procurement side of things. But I've been involved in procuring across each one of these contexts over the past 30 years. And I can say without a shadow of a doubt that while we may have had in the early days, because they were monolithic type contexts, you bought a mainframe from IBM or ICL or Digital or whomever it might be, and you licensed their technology that ran on those mainframes and mini computers. You had the operating system, you had application software, which were invariably provided by them. And then over time, third parties came into the market and began to develop software applications and so on, and brought their own terms and conditions into play. But in the early days, it was very much that you had simple contracts for expensive, but relatively simple from a contractual and commercial procurement perspective. They were less complex than what we have seen in the meantime. Over time, the market has seen the opportunity to tie contract and commercial complexity to additional revenues. So there was a time, for example, when if you had a server-based piece of software, anybody could use that piece of software on the server. And then they began to segment it and say, well, we'll charge you a license fee for the software that runs on the server, but we'll also charge you a fee for every user that accesses that software on the server. So the more users you have, the more you pay us in license fees. And we might also charge you transaction fees for the software that you're using. If you put more transactions through the software, then you pay us more for the utility that we're providing to you. And through those expanding commercial horizons, the contractual side of things became more complex. We're now in the realms of cloud services and cloud computing. And I would suggest that the intricacies and complexities of the contractual and commercial regimes that apply today are far more significant than they were in the early days. So just bear that in mind, folks, that when we're looking at cloud services, cloud computing, and all that goes on within that domain, the contractual and commercial elements associated with those tend to be quite complex, and one should not underestimate the complexity or underestimate the effort that is sometimes required to contract adequately, managing the risk adequately as you engage with the cloud services market. So I'm not going to quote this any further because Enda has already given us a very clear articulation of what the definition of cloud computing is. You can read it in your own time, folks. I also include here the NIST cloud computing definitions, which again, Enda has referred to. And the only thing that I would say is that while the National Institute of Standards and Technology defined these back in 2012, they're as relevant today as they were back then. Nothing really has changed in terms of the cloud computing models, where we have the different characteristics, measured service, rapid elasticity, on-demand, self-service, broad network access being a requirement, and resource pooling, i.e. the optimization of resources in the cloud being a factor for those customers who want to buy those services and the vendors or suppliers that want to deliver them. The cloud service models are predominantly software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. And I'll talk about those in a little bit more detail as I begin to allude to the complexity and the interactions between those different types of service in a cloud or from a cloud procurement perspective. And then we have, of course, the deployment models, which Enda has already referred to. So I won't go into the detail, folks. You can read the slide after the event in your own time, in the same way as I will not address these cloud service models, except in the context of understanding what it is that we might be buying when we're looking at infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service, and how responsibilities change between the cloud service provider and the customer as we move across that tiered model. And the little diagram you see in the top right-hand corner of the screen is the one that sits in the OGP cloud computing guidance note. And the deployment models, of course, Enda has referred to those, and he's given us the specifics of those models as they're articulated by OGCIO in their October 2019 advice note. So again, I let you take that away as simply supporting collateral for what Enda has already delivered to you folks. So if we look at the shared responsibility model, at the lowest level, infrastructure as a service is in essence buying kit. And if we're buying kit, we're buying that kit in the cloud and whatever relevant capabilities are supporting that kit in the cloud. But we're also hosting the operating systems and so on, and the software, the application software are ours. We're simply using the cloud as the provider of infrastructure. So in that context, the cloud services provider has less responsibility in delivering IaaS services, and we have more responsibility in what we deploy on those environments than, for example, as we move up through the PaaS and SaaS. And I'll just talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next slide, folks. This infographic is one that I've taken from the collateral of a company called Synopsys. And I think it describes reasonably well the shared responsibility model. And if we look at, for example, infrastructure as a service, we can see that in terms of the people element, the data element, the application software element, the operating system, and the virtual networks, all of those responsibilities sit with us. The hypervisors, which are the operating systems that are used to manage the virtual environments in the cloud, the servers and storage, and the physical networks are the responsibility of the cloud service provider. As we move into platform as a service, we see that the cloud service provider takes on responsibility for the virtual networks and the operating system. And then, of course, as we move into software as a service, the cloud service provider has responsibility for the applications. And that is something that is fundamental to the cloud services, understanding the cloud services environments and the differences between the responsibilities between the cloud service provider and the customer. In our instance, it'll be the public sector body as we contract for infrastructure as a service, for platform as a service, or the end solution of software as a service. And I think that's, if we take nothing else from today's session, folks, if we have that understanding of where those bounds of responsibility occur and where they differ, where we pass from ours to the CSPs and vice versa, then I think it will be good learning for us. This mind map, folks, and this is the first mind map that I've shown you, is in essence an articulation of what Enda has already given you. And all I've done is taken what is in the OGCIO advice note and articulated that in a mind map across the various headings and subheadings that are covered there. So Enda has already covered this. I'm not going to go into it, folks, in any more detail, to be perfectly honest. I let you take it away, and as I say, you'll have this mind map as a PDF and as an actual mind map native file subsequently, if you want to use it as an aid memoir or use it to help you structure your deliberations when you're embarking on cloud services projects. One of the things that we stress in the OGP Cloud Guidance Note is that before we undertake cloud services procurement, we need to understand the market. We need to understand who is out there providing what services and how those services are delivered to their customers. But we also need to undertake the key pre-market activities relating to the solution. What is the best solution for our needs? Are we simply looking for information infrastructure as a service, or will we be looking for platform as a service with the development and test environments, for example, and the operational infrastructure hosted in the cloud? Or do we want a full solution? Are we, for example, looking to replace an end solution, for example, a HR or a human capital management, as it tends to be called today, system, in which case we might be going to SaaS solution providers in the marketplace. We need to undertake a data protection impact assessment. We need to undertake adequate risk and benefit analysis so that we can understand what the market is like. We need to understand the experiences of other people and so on. And then we need to understand the contractual and commercial terms that will apply. This is a very simple document, folks. I won't go through it in detail, but it's simply something that shows you the type of information that's out there that will help guide our understanding of the market and how the market is likely to evolve over the coming years. And this is a hype cycle document provided by Gartner. They provide hype cycles for all sorts of aspects of cloud services.
Sorry, Ray, I'll just let you know 5 minutes to go there.
5 minutes. I'm going to move on very quickly then. So one of the things you will see, folks, as I move through these next slides, there's a lot of detail in them. I let you read them in your own time. This document, in essence, is the articulation in a mind map of what the cloud, the OGP, Cloud Computing Guidance Note entails. On the right-hand side are the key contractual implications, the term, termination, security, and data protection. Item number 5 there are the boilerplate terms that we see coming into play around warranties, liabilities, and indemnities. And then item number 6 there are the pricing models and other contractual considerations that come into play. Use that as a generic map, if you like, of the context that apply when we're looking at contractual and commercial regimes. I'm going to skip over this quickly. This is simply an example of, for example, a software provider, a SaaS software provider. It's SAP with their HCM suite and the usage metrics that apply for the software that they're delivering in the cloud. Again, it just begins to touch on the topic of the complexity of the metrics that sit behind cloud services delivery, particularly when it comes to SaaS. Data topics, for example, that will be required to be considered for cloud services contracts are set out in this. I won't walk through them. Again, it's simply a checklist or an aid memoir to use for you to use, folks, as you move into this this area. What I'm showing you here now, this is where we move into the agreement versus contract structure, and this is showing you a typical software as a service, cloud service provider agreement structure, where they have general terms and conditions, their cloud services, and then consulting services, schedules or agreements that sit behind the order form, which is the driving contractual commitment document for cloud services providers. And I'm sorry for speeding through this, folks. I'm going to very quickly bring you into some of the metrics for cloud services providers so that you can understand them. In essence, cloud services providers are providing, recognizing revenue in a different way to those that you might already have dealt with as on-premises providers. They're focused on the long-term customer profitability, which is driven by 2 fundamental elements: lifetime customer value and customer acquisition cost. I will send you some further information describing the metrics that sit behind this, but I think it's probably useful for people to understand how these metrics apply and how the market looks to engage with contractually and commercially with its customers from the perspectives of driving or optimizing customer profitability over time, and having these metrics, if you like, as the key guiding mechanisms to deliver that. This slide here, folks, simply shows in a complex solution delivery environment, we can have at the bottom a platform owner. It could be the likes of SAP providing their capabilities under their agreement terms and conditions and supporting schedules. On the top of this diagram, we're seeing, for example, a systems integrator who would step in to deliver that solution for a customer. They will have their own agreements with their own terms and conditions. And when these agreements coalesce, it brings complexity into play. You need to be very careful and very watchful of the complexities that can apply when this type of cloud services context is being considered. I mentioned earlier the agreement types and so on. As solution providers, for example, are delivering their services, they'll deliver them under typically statements of work. This simply describes a typical outline for a statement of work. I'll let you read it in your own time and I'll provide this to you, but this is the type of rigor that we would be expected to apply in the schedules that would sit behind the contracts that we're putting in place with cloud services providers in order to ensure that they deliver what we want to get, taking on board the risk factors that apply as we're engaging with the market and the vendors, and also ensuring that the business scope that we're envisaging to, and the benefits that we're envisaging to deliver on the back of this are actually delivered through a rigorous mechanism, such as the use of statements of work and the like. And this simply articulates one of the commercial mechanisms we can use to make sure that we are fully aware of and can keep track of the commercial regimes that are applying when professional services are being delivered by providers in the cloud services marketplace. And I'm sorry for rushing through this, folks, but as I say, there's substance in these slides and I hope that you'll get value from them as you read them afterwards. My final comment to you is that in 2020, we saw a significant downturn in spend across the global information and communications technology market. In 2021, it's forecast that there will be a significant uplift as we're coming out of pandemic, as global business confidence is growing and so on. And Gartner are showing across these subcategorizations of information and communications technology, data center systems, devices, enterprise software, IT services and communication services, they're seeing significant uplift in 2021. That, as we move into 2022, settles for some of those subcategories. But if you look at the enterprise software and the IT services categories, it's forecast that those global spend areas will grow as we go into 2022. That is driven to a large extent on the enterprise software side by cloud and software as a service solutions. And on the IT services side, infrastructure as a service and platform as a service are key contributors to that continuing growth in spend across those sectors. So the point is, folks, cloud is here to stay. Cloud investment globally will grow. As we engage with the cloud marketplace, we will be spending more and more with the cloud vendors. We need to make sure when we do engage with the market that we do so on the most beneficial contractual and commercial terms that we can.
Mark Burke, Chief Quantity Surveyor, Dublin City Council. Payment Solutions Service, a case study of cloud-based solutions by Dublin City Council.
Basically, just by way of introduction, I'm not a techie. I'm in no way technology related. The smartest thing I have is probably a smartphone. So when I probably could have used the lads, Fergal, John, and Ray, when I embarked on this, it kind of came about probably 2017, when I was actually sitting with I had a light bulb moment when I was sitting with a local government auditor and going through essentially our term maintenance and our voids program. So what that is essentially when we refurbish uh, existing housing stock that we have, um, when a tenant either moves out or is relocated. So from that perspective, the local government auditor was asking me questions that I just didn't have the answers for. So I started to dig around and see what was there, and essentially just to give a brief overview, the term maintenance program itself is kind of 36 million up to even 40 million a year. We upgrade about 1,000 units. Within the schedule rates or the bill of quantities, we have 856 specific items. So fortunately, we're limited to those items. We operate in 6 kind of catchment areas, if you want to call them. There's 12 contractors per area, so we could have anything up to 60 contractors. Now, some of them go across some of the areas, and then we have 5 user types. When I talk about user types, that's anything from an architect to the quantity surveyor to internal administration to the contractor themselves and people like that. So, as I said, the system itself, when I sat down with the auditor, when we take a 2-year cycle of the actual voids framework that we have in place, we could have anything between 30,000 to 40,000 paper records, and they could be anything from a cert, a completion cert, all the way through to the schedule, the works that need to be done on a particular unit. So, and they could be in multiple and duplicated across, even within the organization. I think when I looked into it, we had about 4 different locations for all this paper and different boxes. So if you wanted to find a particular unit, you had to have somebody that had knowledge of where the stuff was filed and where everything was. So some of it was electronic, but the vast majority of it was paper based. The challenges then around we had stretched resources. So between QS administration, the maintenance team, the area maintenance officers, there was multiple stakeholders within it, and we're all stretched. And it was just by matter of process more so than anything else that we were stretched. There was a siloed understanding of the actual process. So when even within the organization itself, you would have, as I said, the maintenance team, you would have us in QS, you would have the architects, you would have the area maintenance officers, which were on site, and then you would have the contractors themselves. So all different pockets would have different information at any different time. There was nothing live. It was all kind of legacy stuff. You didn't really know where properties were or what was happening in each place. And the communication between us was very disjointed. So you had some area maintenance officers dropping in their handwritten task orders. You had some emailing them. You had some posting them in. So at any point in time, it was very difficult to know where a property was, at what point was it going to be finished, and all the different strands of it made it kind of very complicated, and just the whole process. I kind of said to myself, there has to be a better way of doing it now. From that perspective, when I talk about this and I talk about the steep learning curve in procurement, I've learned a hell of a lot. I've even learned even more this morning. And a lot of what I did predated a lot of the guidance that's kind of come out in 2019, 2020. So from that perspective, I will talk about what I did, but it's not necessarily the way that I would do it now, and there's other things coming up that I'll talk through. So when we talk about a pilot in the procurement sense, that's something similar to what Ray and John and Fergal kind of said about. They talked about doing your research. So what I did on the ground was simple Google searches. Now, not the best way of doing it, but it did get kind of 4 or 5 suppliers that might be in this space. I didn't really know what I was looking for, so I reached out, made a couple of phone calls. Probably could have done a bit more research in that space, but what concluded from it was that I got a small developer, a small IT developer, to sort of say whether what I was thinking in my head was it even feasible to go anywhere? Was it dead in the water from day one? So the guys came in. Now, what I would say to anyone out there is, don't be afraid of investigating. Don't be afraid of kind of reaching out and having a look and doing those Google searches. But I will say then you need to ensure that the pilot itself or any of that kind of research doesn't bleed into contradicting any of the procurement guidelines that are there. So for you need to have, I'd nearly take it back a step when you're doing your research, is to look at the guidance documents and actually plot out the stages. So a simple thing that I would do now is just send out a pin notice to sort of a fairly generic statement to say what you're kind of looking for, and the market will actually react to that. And that in itself, you can invite the guys in to give you presentations, and that will flush out what your requirements are for your design brief, or what you're kind of thinking, is it going to work, is it not going to work? So from a procurement point of view, I would say definitely reach out to the guys within your own team, within your own organization with regard to IT. They know a hell of a lot more than I definitely do, and anyone potentially listening in today. We were fortunate enough to have an ICT design framework in place in DCC that could be utilized for this kind of work. I will say, and I will reiterate and reinforce what the guys have been saying all morning, do reach out to the procurement expertise, because I made an error where I have vast amount of construction procurement expertise, but IT is completely different. Again, I'm saying don't be afraid of it, but don't get the two confused. Don't think that one construction procurement, if you have any knowledge of that, that's going to translate into the IT sector. They are two different beasts, and the guys, I think, have touched on multiple things to be cognizant of when you're looking at that. From a lessons learned point of view, plan. Spend the time in the research. It will save time down the line. It really, really will. So what do we do on the ground? Establish the process. So fundamentally, the term maintenance process broke down into 6 stages. I thought it was going to be much more convoluted. When you actually do that bit of desktop exercise, just look at what the stages are, and you'll realize there's only a handful of key kind of stages that you need to kind of develop, or you need to kind of put into a cloud solution. Work closely with the end users. So something that I kind of ran before I could crawl is to map out all the different stakeholders. it's something that Ray touched on with the mind mapping. It's a good exercise, but also to do it with your organization. So who is actually going to be using it at the end? To be honest, I don't. This solution, it's not something that I'll be logging into every day. So identify those key people that are going to be using it on the ground, and that will help further down the line to actually implement the product or the solution. Design and iterate. So that was working with the guys on the ground. So fundamental to the solution was the area maintenance officers who are going to be punching in the data. So you get that data input right day one, it's going to give you the results that you want. At further stages, you're reporting, everything hinges on that. So work closely with them and do that. What I wanted, the fundamentals that I wanted at the very, very start was a modern way of doing things. So something that was very much big red buttons. It didn't take any training. For anyone could pick it up. They could pick it up on their phone. They could pick it up on the tablet. They could be sitting at the desktop. That it was very intuitive in the way. So it didn't need anyone sort of looking over your shoulder, having to train you up. It wasn't clunky in the way it was presented. So they were key fundamentals. Again, you might have different requirements in that sense when you're looking at what you're doing. The guys have touched on it and makes my life a bit easier in this sense, but do be cognizant of the contractual obligations. One thing I wasn't I had the blinkers on with regard to, I was looking at the development. You need to take the holistic approach and see how it's going to be, once it's implemented, how is it going to be maintained? As John kind of touched on, what's the pricing model? How are you going to interact with that supplier after you're utilizing the product? So again, reach out, get that legal advice, get the again, it's a step back. It was something that I should have done at the start, is to look at those end user requirements, look at the contractual obligations to that, see how many people are going to be involved, build up all that information before you kind of press the launch button on it. The intellectual property rights was something that we kind of we had to get advice on, because we were developing a bespoke system for DCC. So some things you mightn't have that difficulty when you're looking at stuff that's off the shelf or out of the box solutions. And GDPR, we had to write it in. It was a step away from what we were actually doing with the solution, but it was the term maintenance framework. Then we had to write in that the contractors, the data, and particularly the commercialities around their rates could be utilized within the system and could be drawn out, and to give them trust in the system, that so they would actually utilize it. But it all had to fit into the GDPR envelope. I'll just show you some of the systems very, very quickly. This is kind of what it looks like on the ground. It links across multiple platforms. So essentially, I could be sitting on a beach in Spain, and I could log in and I could see where a particular property is at, see where it's been, who's doing it, what stage, all that kind of stuff. So it works. It's essentially just an application that you download off Google Play or one of those. What the benefits? One of the particular benefits is better cost control. So the rates there are all they're just generic ones, but you can see the items within. We could see very, very clearly, very quickly across multiple contractors who was the best, what was the best value on a particular unit. We could track across what was happening, and it provides very good workflows. So it's prompting different people at different times, and that's something that I think cloud solutions do very, very well these days. They again just kind of certain things. One thing that the cloud solution has done particularly is to amalgamate all those 30-odd thousand paper documents that were sitting in post room somewhere, or it's all loaded and makes it very, very easy for the contractors to interact, the area maintenance officers to interact, and just keeps the record. So in 5 years' time, if we're refurbishing that property again, we can see the certification is there, the health and safety requirements are there, everything is in the one place, and it makes it very, very accessible. One thing I'll actually say as well is that I think John touched on it with regard to the data transfer. When you're setting it up, is one thing I made sure is that you're not restricted to any one, even though it's a bespoke system, we're not restricted, DCC isn't restricted to the particular vendor. We can make sure that the data migration is very easy and very simple. So if you, again, it's linking it back to not only the performance of your own internal staff, but the performance of the vendor, that if you're not, you might have to conclude the contract early because you're not getting that performance, but it's making sure that the data is easily transferable after that. The live reporting piece is excellent from that point of view. You make sure that the data, the quality of the data is there. It's easy to use, it's easy to interpret, it's easy to report. And then indirect benefits that I didn't expect when I set out in this journey. The automation procurement. So what I mean by that is within the framework itself, there's certain gates within the term maintenance framework, and that can all be put in. That's all in the system now, that essentially a contractor can't exceed a certain amount of units at any one time. All that piece is linked to the system, which is great. We can rank the contractors to see about their performance now. We haven't fully integrated that yet, but it's something that down the line we can see that they're meeting certain KPIs, and you can kind of see for the next, when we're looking at the next framework, that we'll be able to do an analysis and kind of use that. And then the recruitment process, some people may be involved within this, but it just streamlines that whole piece, that the Department of Housing in this instance can log into the system as well and can see it. And from an audit point of view, I no longer have to sit for a fortnight with a local government auditor. They can literally log in themselves and see where the information is. It's all there, one place. It's great, but it can all be done remotely in various different ways. So just to say, looking forward, I've learned a hell of a lot from this process. I would do the process a little bit differently. The guidelines are there now. I'd advocate reading them as well. Again, don't be too afraid of the information that's there. I'm not a techie. If I can do it, you guys can do it. But do reach out. Do look for that advice because it's there. And just give it a go, to be honest.
Open panel Q&A discussion.
So I'm just going to start with a question for Enda, if that's okay. And Enda, a question came in to ask, what stage is the government data centre at?
Okay. Well, my understanding is that the process for procuring a contractor to build the data center is underway. But if whoever's asking, they could talk to the infrastructure team within OGCIO if they need to check anything in the meantime. There might be something that can be done in the meantime.
Okay, thank you for that. Fergal and Ray and John, this one's for you. Is there any advice in terms of evaluating the cost criteria where some costs are fixed and some are variable?
I guess the key thing there is to understand, just like the theme of the OGP presentation, the key there is to understand what the market is likely to offer and ensure that your TCO model or your various cost structures and the construct around your cost expectations are clearly set out. There's no point, for example, looking for variable costs for element X if the market only provides fixed costs and vice versa. So in preparing and in doing your analysis and your research, you need to make sure that the construct of your cost response that you're putting out for everybody to respond to needs to match what the market will offer. I guess that's the key thing. It's difficult. It's difficult. Nobody ever said this was easy. It is difficult to try and anticipate, but by doing our market research, by actually going in depth into understanding what the market can offer, hopefully you can come up with a construct for those commercials that will actually work.
Okay, and just following up. Oh, sorry, Ray, you had something.
I was just going to say, in addition to that, so that's the market-facing approach. You then have to look at the demand side of things. So if we don't have clarity around the likely demand over time, it's artificial. You know, we're looking to the market to give us an indication of pricing, fixed or variable as the case may be, for a demand that we're anticipating. If we don't have those demand projections correct, then it's a false premise. So our whole underlying TCO, or total cost of ownership model, won't stand up to scrutiny in the fullness of time if our demand, for example, turns out to be 3 or 4 times more than we had anticipated. So that's something that a lot of care needs to be taken on, understanding the demand. And in my experience on large enterprise deals, going back over many years, the one area in which they tend to fall down is that the demand, either overestimating demand or underestimating demand, is a crucial factor in enterprise deals not delivering the value that they were anticipated to deliver. So that's just something to be very careful of. Understand the demand and have as much clarity as you possibly can on it.
Okay, thanks very much. Just a question then, and it really relates to the data protection impact assessment. Is there a different level of risk analysis necessary in terms of the data security between the different service models, SaaS, PaaS and IaaS? I suppose that's to our friends in OGP as well, and Ray.
Well, I can touch on that very briefly. The fundamental is, if you look at that shared responsibility model, the one that I showed, you can see how the responsibility differs across the different type of services. So if it's infrastructure as a service, the responsibility for example, the platforms, the operating systems and so on, the application software and the data contained within that, because it'll be residing on the infrastructure, but all the cloud services provider is doing is providing kit or an infrastructure in which to host something. So the obligation in terms of data security rests more strongly with the PSB for IaaS than it does, for example, with a SaaS provider, where the data and the applications are sitting very firmly within his domain and he's controlling that environment. But again, I think the point was stressed by Enda at the outset is that we can outsource our responsibilities, but we cannot outsource our accountability for the services that are going out to the cloud that we are ultimately responsible for delivering to our end users.
So the message I'm getting again and again is preparation is key, and knowing your market, you know. And just in terms of then guidance to contracting authorities, is there any further guidance outside of, I suppose, the advisory notes in terms of how they may be clear on whether it is a SaaS provider or whether a SaaS model they're looking for, or whether it is the IaaS or the PaaS that they're looking at? Is there, like, there seems to be some overlap there. Is there any way to kind of help them differentiate and know what they're looking for?
Again, just based on my experience, and I'll let Enda and John and Fergal correct me or contradict me on this, but the fundamentals from my perspective are there's a group coming together to form a a project team, if you like, to look at the procurement options. That will include technologists, business folks, legal, procurement, and so on. Between them, they need to have an understanding. So the technical folks might well say, well, the infrastructure that we're using today is old infrastructure. It's creaking at the seams. So therefore, we're not going to take anything and host it on our infrastructure. So that straight away drives a decision to, if we're going to replace it, are we going to replace it with on-premises? Well, no. If the instructions we're getting are to look at the cloud, it straight away pushes you into, okay, so we're now looking at infrastructure as a service. The question then is there something beyond just the infrastructure? Can we outsource some of the other capabilities that we otherwise struggle to provide ourselves? And that's where you're beginning to look beyond IaaS into the realms of adding PaaS to that. And then perhaps if you're looking at replacing a solution, if you're saying, well, our old HR system or whatever system we might be using is creaking at the seams, we need to go to the market. Let's get a supplier who can deliver an end solution to us seamlessly through the cloud as a software as a solution, the software as a service solution. That would then drive the decision. So there are quite a number of factors that go through that decisioning process. So what I'm saying is there's not quite any one size fits all. It requires deliberation.
I agree, Ray. And in addition to that, while you may feel that the application you have in your on-premise your on-premise solution is actually fit for purpose, when you actually go interrogating the license conditions around that, you may find actually that you don't have permission to run that on somebody else's infrastructure. You may be constrained where you can actually run that application, and that might well drive another factor. As Ray says, there are many factors, but that's another factor that may well drive your decision.
Okay. And I know John touched on it as well around there's a lot of kind of migration costs on whether you should be able to do something and be aware of those. And so also, Ray, you touched on a rate card as well, and I know John did as well. And Ray, you had a template for a rate card. When would you need to be looking to use a rate card in the procurement? Like, is this something you need to be aware of right at the beginning as part of your market research?
Well, it would be useful to have an indication of what the typical market rates for the types of resources that we'll be going to the market to provide would be, so that as we're building our business case internally, we can start projecting, what are the likely costs of doing this, that, and the other thing, which might drive our decision to go to the cloud or not, as the case may be, or go for a full cloud delivered service as a SaaS solution, or just go for IaaS or PaaS. So having an indication, having rate cards, or having visibility of what the market rates are across those resource types are useful. The other benefit for it is, as you engage with a vendor and they come on board to deliver a solution for you, that will be a long-standing relationship. Nobody just comes in, does a job for you, and then disappears. There will be post-live support provision. So you'll be getting support from the cloud services provider, or perhaps the systems integrator who delivered the solution for you. And you might say, well, we need to amend these systems or augment these applications over time, in which case you'll be kicking off mini projects with statements of work. The rate card would sit behind those. So if we're likely to require a project manager, a technical architect, a solutions architect, a senior developer, a junior tester, a senior tester, whatever it may be, we can estimate what the rates may be. But more importantly, we may actually bake in rates in our agreements with the cloud service provider or the systems integrator, which give us a surety and comfort that those rates are going to apply for whatever the duration might be, so that we have certainty that a rate today is not going to double in 6 months or a year or 2 years' time.
Okay, very good. And maybe a question back just to Mark then, just again from a non-technical point of view. I know you're not a procurement expert yourself, but did you find there was any kind of difference in the length of time it took to actually, to prepare and the pre-market engagement to go to market and find an actual provider in terms of a standard kind of procurement that might have happened?
No, and if you reach out to the guys, the experts out there, they'll be able to manage that for you. And essentially, I probably lost time in not reaching out initially, and cost myself time probably in the contractual end of things as well, and actually the implementation phase. So you're better off spending the time up front in any case.
Okay. We do have a question then, again, I suppose to Fergal, John and Ray. What is the current minimum time span for publishing an RFI to completing it? How long is a piece of string?
I'll hand over to the experts on that.
Yeah, it is really a case of how long is a piece of string, Debbie. It really depends what you want to get out of the RFI. So on foot of the RFI, you may organize a series of meetings with the suppliers in the market as well to sort of get a better understanding of what's out there in the market. So it'll help you define your requirements when you're putting your tender document together. So I wouldn't. I don't think you can put a specific time limit on it. It's really how much. It's really when you feel that the research is done and that you're ready to go to market. And the RFI is just the first stage of that. In terms of putting it out to the market, generally when you put the RFI out to the market, you just give the tender enough time to respond to your questions. So the amount of time you leave it out in the market depends on how many questions you have in your document and how detailed a response you're looking for. So you could gauge it that way.
Okay.
I think as well, just on that, I think as well, if you're looking for something which is generally, freely available or relatively simple, you'd leave it out in the market for a relatively short period of time. If you're looking at something which may be bespoke or where you really aren't sure if the market can support it or not, you might want to leave it out in the market for a longer period of time. So it depends on all of the stuff that Ray and John have mentioned there.
Okay, and Fergal, just to follow up then, in terms of the evaluation of the tender responses, I mean, typically, who should you have on that evaluation team, given that it's such a specialised area? I mean, I'm assuming you'd need some kind of cloud expert or technical people, but would you need, I don't know, obviously legal advisors, you should have already engaged with those, but who would you kind of see that should be present on the evaluation team?
I guess the usual suspects, Debbie. So you want your ICT department, you want your procurement people, you want your user base, so that the actual consumers of the product that you're buying, whether it's infrastructure platform or software as a service, and you may well want legal representation there to make sure that the responses that have come in aren't trying to pull the wool over our eyes in terms of introducing terms and conditions that we didn't advertise, in terms of introducing, as John alluded to earlier on, introducing URLs or various hyperlinks through their response that say, you must use these terms and conditions, or you must hang your hat on this particular set of rules. So I guess you do need a broad spectrum of people on that group. Legal would probably be less involved than the other key components, but you definitely need technical, the business community, and the procurement community as well involved.
Okay, and just following up from that, then I'm just thinking of, let's say, the smaller organisations or offices or agencies that won't have that in-house IT experience or expertise. Is there any particular kind of areas of training that you could kind of nod to, that they may look to beef up their own knowledge, as part of the pre-tender, the pre-market research? Is there any particular courses or anything out there at the moment that you're aware of that they should look at if they're going to be going to market?
The IPA run a course on IT, and I'm not sure what level of detail it goes into, but it is IT for the public sector. I guess the OGCIO, now, Enda, I can't speak for you, so you're going to have to say whether the OGCIO are available to consult and advise in matters relating to ICT as well across the public sector, or certainly for central government. Enda?
Sorry. If people have very particular scenarios, they can come and talk to us, and we'll advise them if there's something we can provide, or point them in the right direction one way or the other.
Okay, that's great. And just in terms of our OGP, do we have a framework, or is there any plans to have a cloud services framework?
I might take that one, Debbie. I suppose the first step in helping our clients has been the publication of the guidance note. So we will be working with the ICT Category Council, and for our audience today who aren't aware, the ICT Category Council has sector representation. So the sectors who are in the OGP model, education, health, central government, local government and defence, and they're the voice of the customer. So we'll be working with Category Council to look at demand. We're a demand-led organisation, so if we were to look at frameworks or a dynamic purchasing system, it has to be underpinned by demand. We don't want to, march the market up the hill and then have no usage. So, as I say, the note is the first step. We will look at demand, but there are other factors, the challenges around contractual terms and conditions and having to publish a standard set that would be, acceptable to all framework members. So there's a lot of various work streams that would feed in to the decision as to whether a central framework is required or is feasible. So there's, I suppose, no more than the theme today of, the planning stages. There are various work streams that we're going to be undertaking that will inform our decision as to any future arrangement.
That's great. Thanks, Mary. Thanks for that. I'm conscious we've only 2 minutes left, so I suppose if I can go around all of the panelists, I just asked them, is there anything you'd like to add to your presentation, or that you'd like to just kind of quickly add to what's already been said in terms of what any other advice you can give or guidance you can provide to our attendees? If I can start with Enda.
I suppose the presentation were kind of the highlights from the advice note. So there's more detail in there, and there's links to lots of other references and things like that. So for anyone who hasn't looked at it, I suppose go back and read through it. And as the OGP team have mentioned, it can be read in conjunction, or should be read now in conjunction with their note as well.
Okay, and Ray, I go to you next.
Again, I would just stress the points that people have been making. Understand the market, be prepared, understand the internal demand and so on. There's a lot of knowledge, a lot of information there, and don't be slow to get your hands and heads around it. But do tread warily, because there are some bear pits, and you don't want to fall into them. So just seek the appropriate advice, but don't be afraid to jump on the cloud, because it certainly is the way of the future.
Great, thanks, Ray. Fergal and John.
I guess from my point of view, just to reiterate again that the importance of preparing, the importance of knowing what it is that you want, trying to narrow down what kind of cloud service might be appropriate for what you want. And really to reach out, as per that slide that we had with the guy standing in the middle, reaching out to all of those different sources to identify as much information as you can to prepare yourself and put yourself in the strongest position possible to do a safe and a secure procurement, to comply with pure procurement, public procurement regulations, to ensure you you enter into a contract which carries a low risk for the state, but primarily to make sure that what you need is actually supplied by the market.
Okay. And John?
Yeah, just to echo Fergal's comments there. Market research is key. All the information is out there. It's just a matter of locating it and looking into it. And once you've done your market research, then you can define your specifications and your commercial and contract terms and conditions. But if you're procuring cloud services, you really need to procure it with your eyes open. So in this regard, you need to focus on market research too.
Great. And then Mark, just from your own experience, I suppose, is there anything you would have done differently if you had to do it again?
I definitely plan more. Yeah, as I'd reinforce that point, plan, and do reach out to the experts, as the guys have touched on there. The information is there. It's getting more centralized every day from that perspective. So you don't have to go off into multiple strands. I think the OGP is a good resource for that. And don't be afraid, as Ray touched on it as well, don't be afraid to actually understand the information and get your head around it and move as quickly as you can as well.
Debbie Curtis, Office of Government Procurement Moderator. closing remarks.
Yeah, very good. And I think just for my own, as a layperson looking at it, I think there's a lot of areas in there that, I mean, it's been covered obviously in this very succinct and comprehensive way today, but obviously it's very hard to cover everything in any kind of real depth on a 2-hour session. But I mean, areas such as, disaster recovery plans, which may not automatically be included in a contract, it just goes to show you there's a whole awareness and understanding of your obligations that you really need to prepare and make sure you have the right people to inform you if you don't have that in-house.
Thank you for watching the Commercial Skills Academy Masterclass, Demystifying the Cloud. Access further Masterclass webinars and other training materials by logging into the Commercial Skills Academy LMS.